Hi there, welcome to everybody. Hopefully you can all hear us. We've had a few technical gremlins along the way, but I think they've all been fixed. The numbers are creeping up slowly, so I might just give us another 30 seconds or so, see if we get a few more people on, and then we'll make a start. Great. Well, thanks, Sasha, for confirming you can all hear me, which is always a good start. Okay. Welcome everybody to this afternoon session, which is talking about what lies beneath the current trends in the XSS in 2022. So my name is Caroline Roberts, and I'm going to be hosting the chat today. Start off with a big apology. So yes, we did promise 3 presenters. Unfortunately, John Burrs Murdoch, who was going to join us, has sent his apologies. He, as a journalist for the FT, he has a big deadline. It's quite a big news day and quite a lot going on, and he's really sorry, but he's unable to join us today. But don't worry, we've got 2 great speakers, and we've got plenty to talk about between us. I'd just like to draw your attention. You should all see the chat function um, um, on your screens. Please, it would be great if this is going to be we'd really appreciate if this could be a really good interactive session. Matt and Nicola, they're going to talk for about 10-15 minutes each, and so we're going to have at least half an hour left at the end for questions. So please put the questions in the chat, and at the end we'll then have a question and answer session as we'll go through those. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our 2 speakers. So first of all, we've got Matthew Fletcher. So Matt is an associate partner in Aon's Demographic Horizons team. He is Aon's expert on drivers of mortality change, including international mortality trends, causes of death, and COVID-19. Matt is the current chair of the CMI SAPS committee, which produces the standard pension scheme mortality tables for the UK actuarial profession, and is also a member of the profession's COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group, which has produced over 100 bulletins and other publications over the course of the pandemic. And then I'd like to introduce Nicola Oliver. Now, Nicola is the co-founder of Medical Intelligence, which was established in 2007, a consultancy which provides impartial expert insights into the main drivers behind changes in life expectancy and disease risk for the insurance industry. And Nicola works directly with clients to increase their understanding of the medical and socio-demographic elements that impact mortality, morbidity, and longevity risk. Nicola's background includes a long career in the UK National Health Service, firstly in intensive care and latterly in public health. And Nicola is an affiliate member of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and has been chair of the IFOA Diabetes Working Party, member of the IFOA Health and Care Board, previously co-chair and member of the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group, previously deputy chair of the now completed IFOA antimicrobial, I can't say that word, resistance working party. And she has presented on numerous occasions at industry conferences, usually related to providing medical insights to insurers and actuaries. So thank you to both of you for joining us today. So you can see a slide in front of you here, which I'm sure you have all seen. And this is one of the charts that comes out in the CMI's weekly mortality monitor. And this is the one that was published, and these are published every Tuesday. And this is this week's, which shows us up to the week ending the 16th of September. Now, as you can see, the black line, which is your 2021, we have been seeing deaths higher than even 2020 and 2021, pretty much consistently since around about May this year. Now, this is a very unusual pattern. You typically wouldn't expect to see such high levels of excess deaths over a summer period. So this has been something which I think longevity actuaries like myself, we've been talking about for a few months now. And I think it's probably fair to say at the beginning of the year, we kind of thought 2022 is possibly going to be quite a benign year. Here we are, should be coming out of the pandemic, potentially seeing a survivorship effect, where because we've had so many deaths over the last few years, maybe a few less deaths in 2022. So I think this pattern has quite surprised us. So, which is why we thought it'd be really good to have this chat today, this webinar, just to see if we can come up with some reasons why this might possibly be. So Matt, I think if I pass over to you, please, and to make a start.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Hopefully people can hear me as well. As mentioned, I do chair the CMI SAPS committee. I'm not talking with my CMI hat on today, just to be clear. But I mean, a lot of the stuff we'll be using is from CMI. So this is a slightly different way of presenting the data that Caroline just showed, just to sort of reiterate the point that we are seeing high levels of excess deaths in recent months. This is from the CMI mortality monitor report. It's showing mortality rates compared to 2019. So the yellow line at the bottom is the 2019 mortality rate. You can clearly see the pandemic years, 2020 in blue and 2021 in green. And the dark black line is 2022's experience. So again, to reiterate what Caroline was saying, at the start of the year, we were broadly in line with 2019, arguably slightly better than 2019 towards the end of Q1, and that was despite having reasonably high numbers of COVID deaths. But in recent weeks, we have been seeing excess deaths coming through to the extent that we're now seeing mortality rates that are actually higher than not just 2019, but also 2014 now, and sort of the trajectory is looking towards a much higher mortality rate than we saw in 2019. And it's worth pointing out that absent the pandemic, we might have otherwise expected to have seen mortality improvements over that 3-year period. So the fact that we are looking likely to end up quite significantly above 2019 is, again, as Caroline mentioned, quite a surprising and concerning event. So first question is it just COVID-19 deaths? So this chart shows, and it's again from the CMI report, but it's a summary of the numbers that are published on a weekly basis in the mortality monitor. So published both excess deaths on a week-by-week basis and COVID-19 deaths. And you can see from the orange line that in the year to date, there have been over 25,000 deaths with COVID-19 mentioned on the death certificate. Excess deaths are not up to the 25,000 number, but they are increasing faster than COVID-19 deaths, particularly recently, suggesting that excess deaths have been higher and quite significantly higher than COVID-19 deaths for quite some weeks. So what are the sort of possible explanatory factors behind non-COVID excess? Firstly, we can look at what the longer term impacts of COVID-19 infection might be, and Nicola is the expert on this and we'll be talking in more detail on those. But essentially, the knock-on impacts of having had a COVID infection at some point in the past couple of years. Second is significant pressures on the NHS, and there we're thinking about both diagnoses and treatments that have been missed or delayed due to the pandemic, so people being sicker than they would otherwise have been if they had been able to get those diagnoses and treatments during the pandemic. And secondly, and this was what John was going to cover, and I'll try and do his analysis justice, but the sort of current position on urgent treatment, so looking at A&E statistics and ambulance wait times. And the final one is heat waves. So it won't have, you will have been well aware, I'm sure, of very high temperatures from middle of July and in August as well. So what the impact of that is likely to have been on mortality rates over that period. So look, as I say, Nicola's going to do the kind of COVID-19 sort of longer term impact section, but I'll cover the rest in the next couple of slides. But I just wanted to show one thing on that. There are excess deaths across the spectrum, although not there's no obvious impact on cancer mortality as yet. So these charts show, compared to a baseline, what the numbers of deaths are, so what the excess deaths are in England from a couple of key causes of death: coronary heart disease and diabetes are both up significantly, but cancer mortality is not up in recent months. Heat wave. Yeah, so there were several exceptionally hot spells in July and August 2022. So July was 19th of July was particularly hot in 2022, with temperatures seen above 40 degrees. But there were large numbers of days in August as well that are counted as heat wave, so with significantly high temperatures. These charts here, so the previous charts were based on deaths by date of registration, which is what we tend to use to produce the CMI model and for mortality analysis. This chart here shows deaths by date of occurrence, which are more likely to show up at the heat waves than the date of registration, albeit that they are lagged, so we don't have decent data at the very end of August. But we can see here that the purple line for 2022 shows a big spike in the numbers of deaths, 19th of July and also actually 20th of July. It's less clear from the chart, but there is another point just below that 19th of July spike. I plotted as well 2019, firstly because it's the last pre-pandemic comparator year, but secondly because the previous temperature records were set 25th of July 2019, and again you can see a fairly big spike on the 25th of July 2019 when you look at deaths by date of occurrence. It's not clear exactly how many excess deaths there were from the heat wave. Having said that, the numbers of deaths recorded on days which count as sort of being part of a heat wave are significantly higher than the numbers of deaths on the other side. So it could be that there are several thousand deaths that are explainable by having had higher than expected temperatures in July and August. ONS are publishing, I understand, some more detailed analysis on heatwave deaths in the coming week or so, I think 7th of October. So that will be an interesting one to see what they come up with and what their analysis suggests. As I mentioned, NHS pressures. This is a couple of charts I'm going to show from John Byrne-Murdoch's excellent analysis that he published a few weeks ago. So he wrote a very long article with a lot of very interesting charts in the FT, and also a Twitter thread with all the details on. So I very much recommend that you look at that if you have any particular interest in these sorts of issues. But the thesis being that NHS is under significant pressure and sort of more than you would typically see in summer months, and that is sort of directly causing excess deaths to come through. So these charts here sort of speak for themselves, I think. The left-hand side is, all three charts are ambulance response times. The left-hand side is situations that are immediately life-threatening, and the other two are situations where an ambulance is needed, but potentially less immediately threatening to life. And particularly on the right-hand side, you can see that the targets are being missed in recent months, particularly. And yes, for example, on average, someone having a stroke or a heart attack is now waiting an hour for a paramedic, where that wasn't something that had been seen at all in previous years. Here again, there's another couple of charts from John's analysis. The left-hand one is looking at the number of people with long waits in A&E. So this is after the decision to admit. How long do people wait before being admitted? And the right-hand chart part of that, the circle part of that, shows that there are large numbers of people, particularly in recent months, who are waiting more than 12 hours to be admitted to A&E, and there is some analysis, and perhaps unsurprisingly, that suggests that the longer the wait, and particularly if it's over a certain threshold, it can lead to higher mortality, both immediately and sort of following the person's wait for admission to hospital. The right-hand side of this is one of the possible explanatory factors behind pressures on the NHS, which is that sickness absence rates remain well above pre-pandemic levels. That's only one of the indicators that John put in his again excellent analysis. For example, looking at the numbers of people, the numbers of beds available, numbers of doctors available, funding issues, those sorts of things. Again, I definitely recommend that you look at John's analysis, because it's definitely well worth a look. There's a question as to whether this is just a UK or thing, and I think it depends on how you look at it. This is analysis from, or a chart from Our World in Data, looking at the cumulative numbers of all-cause deaths compared to a projection. So it's a kind of a measure, at least, of excess mortality. And what we're looking for here is for upward sloping lines being increasing excess mortality. And you can see that the blue line, which is the UK, is increasing, and potentially increasing faster than some other countries. But we are seeing higher excess mortality in a number of other countries in recent weeks and months. So whilst the NHS issues uncovered by John and discussed a lot in the press are certainly of concern and can't be helping the excess death situation, my view, I guess, is that it's not the sole reason, as in that the UK is not completely exceptional in terms of seeing excess deaths in recent months. Finally, from me, and this is a slight diversion from the other parts, but typically, as a pension scheme and insurance actuaries, we tend to we've got the CMI model, which looks at population level mortality and projects that forwards, but then we tend to adjust that for the portfolio that we're interested in, which typically is higher average socioeconomic group, particularly when you weight by liabilities or pension amounts. So what this is doing is showing that the excess mortality picture is quite unclear in recent months as to whether higher socioeconomic groups have been more or less affected, relatively speaking. What this is suggesting here is that the top chart shows that there's been a greater, this is COVID mortality specifically, the more deprived quintiles have had greater COVID mortality through the pandemic, but that the inequality has increased since the third lockdown. So the bottom chart shows that spread has increased. So that suggests possibly that there is some divergence of experience, at least on the COVID side, if not on the excess mortality side. So that will be a factor to consider in the future as to whether there is going to be a difference in experience for higher versus lower socioeconomic groups. So that was my promised 15 or so minutes.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much, Matt. And so just remind you, there is a chat function. So any questions that you may have, please add to the chat, and we'll be monitoring those, and we'll pick it up, and I will give those to the panel after Nicola has spoken. So thanks very much, Matt, and Nicola, if I hand over to you, please.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. And thanks for setting the scene for what I'm going to share. And just actually a great overview of the situation. So as Matt mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the sort of longer term aspects of this. Won't necessarily explain away what we're seeing right now, but it can help us understand where COVID is going to play a role in perhaps continued excess mortality, but on a much longer term basis, and and also very much around morbidity risk. So we've all heard the term long COVID. It's something that's been in the media on and off for over a year, way back further than that actually. And for many people, it represents a self-diagnosed condition in which people would tend to report such things as headache, fatigue, a sort of post-viral syndromic condition, a little bit like chronic fibromyalgia, something like that. But we know that this is just part of the picture, and this is going to help us to understand quite a bit more about how this virus is going to impact us going into the future. So essentially, long COVID, I'll just give a little brief description of this before I talk a bit more in a more targeted way about how this might affect us. Symptoms that persist for 4 weeks or longer tends to be the major descriptive element here, and this is the kind of criteria that most health bodies will use. And it isn't confined to just the neuropsychiatric type disorders. And this is because a very small biology lesson here, just to remind us that the SARS-CoV-2 virus enters its host cells, particularly those cells that express a particular type of protein known as ACE2. And unlike an influenza virus, which enters its host cells most predominantly via cells of the respiratory tract and really not many other types, SARS-CoV-2 enters these cells expressing ACE2, and these cells are found abundantly throughout the body. So it's not just limited to the lungs, and obviously we understand SARS COVID-19 as primarily a respiratory disease, but also the cells that make up kidneys, pancreas, the brain, the heart itself, the whole of the vasculature, so that's arteries and veins, and so on and so forth. So it's not just something that people are able to slowly recover from in terms of a post-viral fatigue picture, but what we're actually looking at is end organ damage as a result of having had COVID, And I will just stress that this is not confined to the sickest. So we know, of course, that people who are in intensive care, whatever they are intensive care for, will be discharged with some potentially long-term problems. And in fact, 50% of anyone that's ever admitted to intensive care will be diagnosed with something known as post-intensive care syndrome. And this is a PTSD type picture, along with some organ damage too. So we're principally looking at new onset conditions, chronic conditions in those who are previously not at any risk. So I'll highlight some of those areas in the next slide. So what we're looking at here are some of the organ systems that are involved in the damage that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So first of all, we'll take a look at the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is that which produces all of the hormones within the body, and that also includes such things as insulin and thyroxine. And from an insulin perspective, this is one of the key areas of concern right now, is that the cells of the pancreas that produce insulin are damaged by the SARS-CoV-2 virus through direct entry, and then the way that the virus replicates is it then bursts that cell, and so you get actually direct damage. But there's also sort of secondary pathways of damage. But what we're trying to focus on here is that the ability to produce your own insulin can be temporarily compromised. And we have certainly seen this in studies in which the diabetic profile of patients who've had COVID are categorized and followed up. And it's not just those who might have been at risk of diabetes to begin with. So I'll show you a slide on that subsequently. Secondary to that is damage to the thyroid gland, and all of the things that's responsible for, which also includes potentially heart valve damage. And from a secondary basis, what has been noticed as well is that people who are treated for severe disease or moderate disease are often treated with steroids, and these have an effect on bone mineral density. So we see long-term bone mineral thinning. Now, all of these conditions can be reversible, in as much as people can be temporarily placed into a diabetic situation, but there are some people that go on to not recover from that condition. Their ability to produce their own insulin is permanently compromised, and therefore they then result in a diagnosis of diabetes. I've talked a little bit already about the neuropsychiatric aspect, and we certainly quite a lot of people in the UK, and in fact I'll show you a slide on that shortly, are reporting long COVID in terms of the sleep disturbance and fatigue picture. This is described as a muscle pain, joint pain, headache, inability to concentrate, brain fog as it's known, and a PTSD type experience. And again, this isn't confined to people who are terribly sick, and it's often people who have just received a confirmed diagnosis of COVID and then have gone on to develop these conditions, sometimes debilitating them up for up to 2 years as we speak now. One of the other areas that became quite evident early on, and was actually an area of shared clinical expertise and learning amongst intensive care units in particular, was the sudden rise in thromboembolic events. So what I'm talking about are strokes and caused by clots. Clots that could also travel to the brain and to the lung. And this is because the normal way that the body responds to being able to clot or not to clot, and obviously doing that at precisely the correct time is extremely important. That is also damaged by the virus that is responsible for COVID. So there are populations of reasonably young people who were never at risk for having a stroke or a brain clot actually being diagnosed with these conditions. And again, this can be an acute situation, but this could also be something of a chronic situation. Moving on, clearly, most people equate the COVID-19 illness with a respiratory disease, and it primarily attaches itself, and obviously that's the portal of entry through the respiratory tree. And the damage that can be caused to the lungs can again be temporary, but it can also be long-term. One of the things that happens to lungs that are acutely inflamed is that they may develop scarring. Now, an acute situation, again, can be reversible, a bit like a sort of temporary diabetes picture I was talking about. But if it goes on and becomes a chronic problem, you end up with pulmonary fibrosis, which simply means scarring of the lungs. And unfortunately, this is a non-reversible condition. It results in reduced pulmonary function in that individual. And unfortunately, that is also a progressive condition. So lung function will over time slowly reduce. And that has an impact on all parts of that individual's life. I'll just talk about the kidneys next. Now, the renal system is very vulnerable to the impact of the virus. Not just the virus, but again, people who are very sick in hospital, moderately to severely sick, the kidneys are extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in blood pressure. And when people are quite compromised and sick, blood pressure tends to fluctuate quite wildly. You can go from very low to very high and back again within a short space of time. And this can cause something known as acute kidney injury. So that's a situation where the kidney has been has had an acute injury in terms of a lack of blood supply. This can cause temporary problems with the kidney, often requiring the individual to have dialysis. However, again, this can be a temporary, acute and reversible situation, but in some individuals, they can go on to develop chronic kidney disease. And this is, again, like lung disease, an unfortunately progressive illness in which the kidneys will slowly over time reduce in their effectiveness to the point where they actually stop functioning altogether. And it's difficult to halt the progression of the disease. You can slow it, but it's not particularly easy to halt it. And kidney disease as a longer term complication of COVID is certainly being seen in certain populations. And last, but by no means least, is the cardiovascular system. So that's the cardiovascular system as a whole, not just the heart. And we're certainly seeing damage to heart muscle, myocarditis, a bit like lungs. They can be acutely damaged, a bit like kidneys. That can be reversible, but in some cases, it's not reversible. The damage is permanent, and you end up with fibrosis of the myocardium, the heart muscle. And what that does is that prevents that part of muscle in the heart from actually working. So you have a compromised heart, not pumping effectively, something very similar to the heart you see after somebody's had a heart attack. So that can lead on to various complications, not least heart failure. And that simply means where the heart's not pumping effectively, and therefore you get some backlog of fluid in the system, causing all sorts of complications. But also does put that individual at risk of actually developing a heart attack or an MI at some point in the future. But also very importantly, think about the linings of every artery and vein. Now they are lined by a particular type of cell, known as an endothelial cell, and these are very vulnerable to the impact of the virus itself. And what that can do, if you damage the actual integrity of those veins and arteries, they again become no longer effective, and that can lead to things such as high blood pressure. So we can see that it's not just a condition that gives people something of a respiratory compromise for a short period of time, that in fact pretty much the whole body can be affected. I haven't mentioned the brain as a physical organ. I've talked about neuropsychiatric, but that is caused by actual physical damage to brain cells by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So how widespread is this problem? Well, in the UK, we keep count of the self-reported prevalence of long COVID. The most up-to-date report in my slide deck here is from the end of July this year. 3% of the UK population were reported to be living with long COVID at this time. And of those 3%, a good 3/4 of those are reporting that the symptoms adversely affected their day-to-day activities. That's about 1.5 million people. And in fact, 384,000 people report that their day-to-day activities have been limited in what's described as a lot. So therefore, they cannot work, they cannot leave the house and undertake their normal day-to-day activities. So this is having a profound impact on people's day-to-day living. So I'm just going to look at two research studies that have been published this year that gives us a bit of an idea on how this looks in actual physical numbers and risk. So the studies I've chosen have been taken from a US cohort data set. It's the US Department of Veteran Affairs. And in this first final analysis slide, what we're looking at is the hazard ratio for having a diabetes diagnosis, use of antihyperglycemics, and a composite outcome of the two. So this is excess hazard ratios versus a contemporary control group. The variables such as propensity to be pre-diabetic or any sort of diabetic type profile in those individuals has been taken account of. And what we can see at a year is that the hazard ratio for diabetes is around about 1.4. For continuing anti-hyperglycemic use, so these are drugs to control blood sugar, that's up at about 1.85. And the excess burden at 12 months, as you can see, for per 1,000 people at 12 months is also highly increased. So what this is telling us is that up to a year after a diagnosis of COVID in people who weren't necessarily all admitted to hospital, we can see evidence of continuing diabetes diagnosis, which would suggest that that is a permanent diagnosis. And similarly, what we have here is analysis done on the same data set, and this is a much larger cohort they took out of that data set. And again, looking at the experience of those who'd had COVID versus a contemporary control group, that at 1 year post-diagnosis, that there was a hazard ratio risk of 1.5 for something known as MACE, and that basically means major adverse cardiovascular event. So that could be an MI or death from MI, and any cardiovascular outcome at all, the hazard risk was much higher. And excess burdens, again, at 1 year persisted in both of those particular outcomes. So what that is telling us overall is that COVID-19 is a disease that is not simply confined to a few weeks of a respiratory acute illness, that we're likely to see a long-term ongoing tail of morbidity sequelae, which could well translate into mortality. So thanks for listening, and I'll hand back to Caroline.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Nicola, for a really comprehensive explanation of everything COVID can lead us to, which is quite depressing, really. But anyway, thank you. So we've now got about just over 20 minutes for questions. So as I say, we've got the chat function. Hopefully, I think a few people have messaged me privately saying they can't find the chat function. So hopefully some people have. I've certainly had one question in, but any way of getting a question to me, then please drop them through. So, Matam, I think you are still there. So, because I think the first question, I think, is going to be coming towards you. So, and I think I'll perhaps widen the question out as well, because it's something I've been wondering. Because a lot of the analysis we are looking at comparing against 2019 deaths. So, just the question was, can you confirm whether that includes mortality improvements? But I think effectively, are we saying, is 2019 a suitable comparison, or are we at risk of actually overstating the issue because we are comparing it against maybe an unusually low year of deaths?
Yeah, thanks. So I think in my presentation, I played a tiny bit fast and loose with excess definitions. So I think that the definition on the CMI versus the OHID and the our world in data, they're all slightly different measures of excess mortality. The one I think is the best approach is the standardized mortality against 2019, which is the CMI approach, and that doesn't include. So I would say the CMI approach is best, I guess, but I think it's the cleanest baseline. That does not include any improvements from 2019, so it's purely against mortality rates as they occurred in the year 2019. So there's no allowance for any future trends. So I think I mentioned briefly at the top we might potentially have expected to have seen some improvements from from 2019. The challenge about whether 2019 is the correct baseline to use, I think the answer is, well, probably the answer is no, but there's not an obviously better one. And what I mean by that is, yes, 2019 was, relatively speaking, it's the lightest mortality, single year of mortality that we've seen in England and Wales. So you could argue that that isn't the point to go from, but equally, we have tended to see mortality improvements in subsequent years when we don't have a pandemic. So if you're suggesting to you, or you so collectively, if someone's suggesting to use a more historic year with some improvements, I think you need to think about what that level of improvements might be, and then you start arguing about the improvements rather than the baseline. But I mean, so yeah, 2019 was a stronger improvement than trend, but if you apply a couple of years worth of improvements to that, then essentially you're back to the 2019 type of benchmark. I did do some analysis to look at where we'd be looking compared to some previous years, so 2018, 2017, for example, and with those, you start off with a very light start of the year, but we're still seeing excess mortality even compared to that baseline, and even when you do the age standardization, so you're allowing for an older and larger population. So yeah, there's lots of different baselines that you can use, and they come up with slightly different answers. But I think regardless of what you use, if you pick something sensible, you do see that you have at least some level of excess deaths over recent months.
That's great. Thank you very much. Okay, this I've got. This is a harsh question, so I'm going to put it to both of you. We've had a number of possible reasons for why we're seeing these excess deaths. Which would you put as number one, being what you think is the most likely? I know I told you it was a bit of a harsh question. Nicola, I'll put you on the spot first. So
okay.
no one's listening. It's fine.
I hope they are. I'm going to be completely on the fence and say I don't know that you can put one as number one.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very much I've been very much looking at the NHS pressure situation, not just based on what's been happening most recently, but how that has led up to where we are now. And we know for certain that things like something called delayed transfer of care. So that's people who are eligible to leave a hospital, but don't leave the hospital for whatever reason. There's not a place for them in social care or able to support them at their own home. That in itself is a mortality risk. So it's really difficult to quantify. There is data on who's eligible to leave and who is sitting in that delayed transfer of care box, but data is a bit delayed on that as well. Definitely the heat wave has had some part to play, and we've got that as an event that's going to just increase in the future. So I'm just not going to answer your question, Caroline. I'm just going to throw in some more ideas there.
No. I think you did answer. It's okay.
We have the knock-on still effect of trying to catch up with things like diagnostic procedures, things like the standard endoscopy type procedures, which have already been given to people who had indications for that, such as a query of stomach cancer or other type of GI cancer. Those haven't happened. We don't know whether those people have gone on to develop more severe disease and whether that's caused current problems. We haven't seen that as a cancer scenario yet, but I don't think the data is going to show us that yet. But certainly from a point of view of heart attacks, stroke, those sort of things, that's a whole sort of crossover between what's happening in the NHS, people not presenting, and the impact of the heat wave.
Yeah. Go on, Matt. I'm not letting you off the hook. Which one would you say?
I guess similarly. I think it's very difficult to disentangle everything. Certainly the analysis that John put out in his thread on the pressures of the NHS and the likely impact. So that is very compelling. I suspect that the impact of the heat waves has possibly been underestimated by some, because I think that has had a pretty large impact. That I think the thing is we just don't normally see that sort of thing in the UK, but it really was just a very extreme compared to previous years. Who knows how extreme it will be compared to future years, but yeah, I do think that had a pretty large effect in July and August. But yeah, certainly the NHS stuff
We did
is
on the heat
yeah.
wave point. Am I right that in previous years we've often seen a heat wave very much bring forward deaths by a few weeks? So yes, a heat wave would bring on deaths, but then actually it was quite frail people. So we then see a drop, so a bit of a survivorship effect, which we possibly haven't seen.
Yeah, so I think that's. I don't know how clear that is from the data. It will be interesting to see the extent to which ONS try to answer that question, because they may have more data that we haven't had. So the thing I have seen is that the excess deaths, even by the date of occurrence, seem to be across the age spectrum, which suggests that it has affected people, not just the oldest and frailest in the population, but sort of a wider range in the population, which
absolutely,
maybe we won't see that effect in the same way. Again, it's very hard to know, because you get a large spike on a few days, and then that kind of the blurring out of the people that would otherwise have died relatively soon after. It's that much harder to pick up than a large spike. But certainly we're not seeing negative excess deaths at the moment, following the heat waves.
Yeah, I would from a clinical perspective, it's going to affect people of all ages who have a pre-existing condition, but that doesn't mean that condition was going to finish them off in the next few weeks. So even younger people with asthma, for instance, exacerbations of asthma in young people, particularly. Heat will also unfortunately exacerbate the impact of the climate crisis, because air pollution plus heat equals even bigger problem for people with respiratory conditions, because the atmosphere then starts to produce ozone at ground level, so that has a separate effect. So there's a whole other group of things that are in the mix then.
Great. Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in, and so thank you for these questions. So in your opinion, is the current trend in excess mortality likely to be a one-off blip or the start of a new trend? And I think kind of just to broaden it a little bit, how long do you think that COVID may be having an impact on longevity? Matt, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so it's the big question. I feel like there are things that it may be possible to fix and sort of fix, just sort of reverse some of the excess deaths that we've seen, in the sense that the extent to which heat waves, the heat wave deaths are either bringing forward or are genuinely a kind of an extreme event that we don't expect to see in future years. We may not see such large excess from those in future years. I think that COVID certainly will lead to increased mortality over the longer term, both direct and indirect. How large that impact will be, again, is the big question, really. So yeah, I think it is an impact, and I think people are starting to, or have been revisiting views on future longevity improvements, albeit that I don't think that the adjustments that people are tending to make so far are huge compared to pre-pandemic expectations, but certainly feels like there's a negative drag on there is an additional cause of death that we didn't have a couple of years ago, and that is going to be causing higher mortality in the future.
Nicola, anything to add to that?
No, I think Matt's quite right to talk about it being an additional source of mortality going forward. Once we reach, and I don't like to, I spoke at an event last week where the question of endemicity and an endemic situation was raised. That's not a good thing. It's just another disease we're living with. It doesn't mean we're not going to see deaths. Flu's endemic, HIV's endemic. So this will be another big cause of death on an annual basis going forward. So if you were to sort of smooth that out over a number of years, then it makes it likely that this isn't going to be just a blip, but an additional source of consideration for mortality.
Yeah. Great. And the questions coming in quick and fast, which meant that the top one
They always
dropped
do
off
at
my
the end.
list.
Yeah.
So apologies. So we did have a question asked earlier on from Natasha. Do you think that the increased cost of living could have impacted the number of deaths, or do we think this is too soon to say?
Sure. It's probably from the current cost of living crisis too soon to say, but of course what we have had is a period of economic hardship for people as a result of the pandemic. Also, if we then, to add that into what's going on now, that might be something that we could sufficiently suggest is a reason. But for this year, I would say probably not. But as we go through the winter, possibly if we have a difficult winter and people are going to have to make the choice, unfortunately, it seems, between whether or not to heat their houses sufficiently or to eat enough. And that's a really big worry for the upcoming winter season.
Yeah. And possibly a similar kind of theme as to what's coming ahead. And do we think that the lack in excess cancer deaths is the elephant in the room for future excess due to these NHS waiting times? Matt, what do you think? Yes.
Over to you, Matt.
Yes, I suspect there will be some excess deaths from cancer coming through due to misdiagnoses, both during the pandemic and following, or misdiagnoses or later diagnoses, which lead then to potentially worse outcomes. There's a question in my mind as to the how big an impact that is on a sort of population level. So clearly there will be numbers of cases and individuals, quite a lot of individuals, I suspect, who will whose deaths will be earlier than they would otherwise have been. But yeah, the numbers, I'm not sure how large those numbers will be. I think that SAGE at the start of the pandemic did some, or on behalf of SAGE, some analysis was done to have a look at the impact of these, and it wasn't, it was thousands of deaths, but spread over a fairly long period of time, which on a population level basis, when we're thinking about whether it's an impact on improvements or not, how big a difference it is, I don't know. But then if we have a situation where we don't get on top of, that was predicated on the basis that the NHS gets back to normal, as in waiting times go back to where they were pre-pandemic, and waiting lists reduce. If we end up in a situation where waiting lists remain very long and the numbers of people on waiting lists remain very high, then clearly that number could go up significantly.
Yeah, I don't have very much to add to what Matt says. He's sort of summed it up quite succinctly. I mean, it's not just a question of catching up on procedures, it's actually the initial referral pathway. We've seen delays in that. There are some very clear targets about when you present to your GP with a concern to when you're seen, and we know that some of those times are elongated. Unfortunately, it's just purely because of catch up and the screening programs themselves. So there are some very successful population-wide cancer screening programs where you're invited to attend. Those all completely stopped during the pandemic because of, quite rightly so, diversion of resources, etc., and not wanting to put people into contact with health professionals if they didn't really need to be. The catch up on those is immense. They're trying very hard. The NHS is working extremely hard, but for some reason there is a missing population. So those who are eligible to be called now and those who are coming forward, there is a certain percentage of people who are not coming forward who should have been called, say, a year or two ago. And that's the concern. And those people have probably decided, well, I didn't go, so I'm just not going to go now. I didn't get called the first time and I don't want to go. So that's one of the concerns, particularly around cervical cancer screening and breast cancer screening. So what that translates into, as Matt quite rightly said, is that we're just detecting cancer a lot later, and therefore the outcome and the prognosis is much poorer.
Cool. Right, we've got 2 more questions coming. I'll see if we can get through them both. So if we can try and keep answers fairly short, if we can. I think first question on the non-medical impact, which is kind of, I think, really coming in from almost the impacts of lockdown, people being isolated, less exercise, more junk food, and so these general impacts on health. Is this going to, do you think this is going to feed into some more excess deaths in the future?
What I'll say, what the research is telling us at the moment is if you were already healthy, you've got healthier during the pandemic. If you were already somebody that had a poor, unhealthy lifestyle, then it just got worse. So whether that translates into more, I don't know. That's what I can tell you from the evidence I've seen.
Yeah,
Matt,
no, nothing in terms of that. I don't think. I think it's very hard to say on that one.
Yeah.
I think the next question is a good one as well. About the upcoming flu season. I think early indications are that Australia is having an early and heavy flu season. So what do we think the impact of that's likely to be? Again, combined with potentially cold temperatures, cost of living crisis, and a strained NHS.
Yeah. So the flu thing was something that people were sort of talking about through the pandemic as to whether it would be, having been through a COVID pandemic, would that lead to better flu outcomes because people are more used to living with a very infectious disease, so more people will stay at home and it won't spread as much, versus having a population that hasn't had flu for a couple of years and therefore it doesn't have the immunity to that. Australia is an interesting case. I think my understanding is, they had a flu season much higher than the last couple of years, but sort of broadly in line with a typical flu season, but just about 2 months earlier than what they normally see. So it will be, very interesting to see what comes through. Definitely, I would suggest that people get their flu jabs to the extent that they're eligible to do so. And it sounds like they also worked out reasonably well what the strain of flu is this season. So the vaccination has been relatively successful in Australia. Again, based on my kind of what I've read rather than kind of deep analysis of it. But yeah, it's again must be of concern. Whether it's going to be a huge event, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
Again,
So
Nicola, I don't know
wait
if
and
you've
see.
got anything to add on that.
Right, I think I'd love to ask Nicola, but
No,
I think we
pretty
are
much.
running out of time,
That's what
I'm
I've read and
afraid.
seen as well.
So
Yeah.
I think I'd just like to thank Matt and Nicola, especially Matt, who stepped up a bit and covered John's slides as well. So thank you both very much indeed. It's always been really always a very interesting topic and some great speakers. I understand a few people may have had a few issues dropping in and out, but to let everyone know that there will be a recording available from this from tomorrow, so which will get sent out to the people who signed up. So if there is anything that you missed, or if you had a meeting that you had to, or important phone call and you missed a little bit, then that recording will be available. So I will finish up there, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you for the good questions that came through, and look forward to presenting another webinar for you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Matt.